It's pretty bad, but the good news is they're bringing on more hybrids. They've got some very popular vehicles in their lineup too, so it's not a total disaster. I mean, this does seem fixable, and we've seen GM can do it, and if GM can, there's every reason to believe that Ford can as well, but they haven't yet.
All about hybrids, it seems. Hey, Chester, thank you so much. Really appreciate you breaking those numbers down, which came out after the closing bell. Chester Dawson of Bloomberg News. He's our Bloomberg News senior editor there in our Detroit bureau. Just to recap, you do have Ford shares down about 5% here in the aftermarket. So, Tim, a gift. There's one of your decliners probably for
It's already on the list, Carol, but I don't even know we're going to get to decliners tomorrow with the earnings that we got.
You're right. We're not going to, because we've got some big earnings. All right, everybody, that's going to do it for us, the Monday edition of Bloomberg Business Week, and what's going to be a really big week of earnings. Alphabet tomorrow, followed by a lot of other big ones. Have a good and safe evening. Balance of Power starts right now.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Kamala Harris and Donald Trump kick off the final week of the presidential campaign in Michigan and Georgia, just a day after Donald Trump's headline-grabbing rally at Madison Square Garden.
We'll have reaction this hour from someone who was there, Shape and Fay of Lighthouse Public Affairs. Plus, we'll speak with Mark Morial of the National Urban League ahead of Harris's closing argument speech on the National Mall tomorrow.
And we'll have the latest from the Middle East as Israel expresses openness to a short truce in Gaza after striking Iranian military targets over the weekend, leading to the biggest daily drop in crude oil prices in more than 2 years. Thanks for joining us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. We'll get to geopolitics after an important weekend in the Middle East here, Kaylee. But of course, it's the presidential campaign that gets our attention after a wild night at Madison Square Garden.
Yep, a packed night at Madison Square Garden with a number of speakers taking the stage, not just Donald Trump. And some of those speakers, of course, had some off-color, racist, sexist remarks delivered that generated a lot of headlines. But there were new policy proposals suggested by Donald Trump as well, including another tax break specifically on people who care for family members.
Another deduction, another exemption now with 8 days left to the campaign, which is saying something. Here's a little taste of the candidates from their weekend on the trail.
When I say the enemy from within, the other side goes crazy, becomes a sound. Oh, how can he say? No, they've done very bad things to this country. They are indeed the enemy from within. But this is who we're fighting. These are the people who are doing such harm to our country with their open border policies.
This is not new about him, by the way. What he did last night is not a discovery. It is just more of the same and maybe more vivid than usual. Donald Trump spends full time trying to have Americans point their finger at each other, fans the fuel of hate and division, and that's why people are exhausted with him.
Joining us now is Bloomberg's Saleha Mosin. So, Saleha, as we await Kamala Harris's closing argument speech at the Ellipse tomorrow, which is, of course, where Donald Trump spoke from on January 6, 2021, should we expect that a lot of that messaging is going to be playing on the division, the character of Donald Trump, potentially with references back to what went down in New York last night?
Yeah, Kaylee, it's interesting to see as we're barreling toward actual election day, even though Americans have already started to take their ballots through early voting and mail-ins. We're seeing Harris pick up on a theme from Biden in 2022, talking about the importance of saving democracy. And this was a campaign line that was attacked in the days after the assassination attempt on Trump's life in July. And so we don't know how it's going to resonate. I wonder if Harris in her campaign have some kind of insight as to what the final closing arguments should include and what voters who are undecided want to hear.
It's interesting to even see the Trump campaign distance itself from some of the rhetoric on the stage last night. This was over a 5-hour affair. Donald Trump spoke long after comedians and others from Tucker Carlson to Don Jr. The campaign said this joke, referring to the reference of Puerto Rico as an island of garbage. This joke does not reflect the views of President Trump or the campaign, unquote. Not everybody bought that line because this was a campaign event. They paid $1 million to rent out Madison Square Garden. They hired all the talent, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, you know how this kind of thing works. Campaign spokespeople, campaign strategists, and staffers are all there. Their jobs are to find out what are people going to say when they take the stage on behalf of our campaign. So it's no surprise that people didn't really buy into it. Maybe it was one set of messages that is a little bit more bombastic was for one part of Trump's constituency, and the other part was to get some undecideds.
Well, and if Donald Trump has moved on after being in New York yesterday, he's in Georgia today. Are we going to see either of these candidates, aside from Kamala Harris in D.C. tomorrow, in anywhere other than a swing state between now and Election Day next Tuesday?
I know, and boy, they might regret that later, because the specter of 2016, when Hillary Clinton thought she was all sealed in Wisconsin and a couple of other states, may come back if there is a post-election mortem of the way this went.
All right, Bloomberg's Saleha Mohsen, thank you so much. Now, another election-related story that we're watching, a fire in a ballot box in Washington state destroyed hundreds of ballots in a county where the congressional race could help determine control of the House.
Clark County officials are working through the damaged ballots. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, you can see what we're talking about. As many voters as possible. The county's auditor, I should say, is encouraging anyone who put their ballot in the impacted ballot box to contact the county or to go to the state's voter portal to track their ballot. Taking a turn now to the Middle East, a new push for peace following Israel's retaliatory strike against Iran over the weekend. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu now says he is open to a short truce with Hamas in exchange for hostages, as proposed over the weekend by Egypt. President Biden had this to say about it earlier today.
We need a ceasefire. We should end this war. It should end, it should end, it should end. Prime Minister Netanyahu stressed that negotiation under fire is better than negotiation during ceasefire. What do you think about that? I'll reserve that for my discussion with him.
For more, we turn now to Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, who had a busy weekend tracking all of this. Nick, just to begin with the retaliation that we saw Friday into Saturday, calculated to not escalate the conflict, the declines that we saw in oil prices would codify that. Does that suggest the Biden administration did have some influence on the way this was conducted?
I mean, that's certainly what the administration is telling us, that they had worked for weeks, essentially, to shape the Israeli response to Iran, and they had really two big issues. One was no strikes on Iran's energy network that could affect the price of oil, and the other one was nuclear sites, because they just felt that that would be so escalatory, represent a step that would just embroil the region even deeper into conflict. And the result, as you saw with the oil market, was essentially a feeling that they had gotten that calibration. They had successfully made that argument with Prime Minister Netanyahu. The result was what you saw was a situation intended to send a very strong signal. So they attacked facilities that produce these ballistic missiles that were fired into Israel on October 1st, and then also air defenses. So a show of strength. Listen, we got your air defenses. We can basically rule your skies. Just try us again. So that's sort of where we've ended up.
Just to reiterate, the moves in oil today, pretty incredible. Brent down more than 5%, the single worst day since July of 2022. It was the biggest one-day drop in WTI since November of 2021, more than 6 percentage points. So the oil market seems to be thinking, all right, we're all looking good here. There also is the question, and we heard President Biden speaking about it, of this ceasefire potential opportunity. Netanyahu signaling openness, we understand, to a short-term agreement. Is this actually close to being reality after months of back and forth, Nick?
I mean, we have been through this dance so many times before, where we have a potential signal from Israel, what they're saying to the U.S. and allies, that they may be willing to do this. But you fundamentally run up to an issue, which is that the Israeli government, Prime Minister Netanyahu, says we are not going to stop until Hamas is eradicated. And even after the death of Hamas leader Sinwar a week or so ago, he said, no, this marks the beginning of the end, but it is not the end. And they vow to keep on fighting. Hamas says they are unbowed. So you have a situation where Israel is saying, as long as Hamas is there, we're going to keep going. It's difficult to see how they would move beyond a temporary ceasefire to something more permanent, because that would then give Hamas the time to retrench and regain its strength, which is exactly the thing that Netanyahu doesn't want.
All
Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, another working weekend for him. Thank you for joining us on this Monday. Now, coming up, we'll look at the impact of Donald Trump's Madison Square Garden from last night with someone who was actually there. Chapin Fay, founder of Lighthouse Public Affairs, is with us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
That there is a dramatic decrease in the level of respect people have for each other, and certainly opponents have for each other. And I thought that last night was a new low in that regard. I mean, when we were champions in that arena, we were a diverse group of Americans from all over the country, different races, and we came together because of our unselfishness and our commitment to be the best we could be.
Bill Bradley, former Democratic senator from New Jersey and New York Knicks legend, on the early edition of Balance of Power today, discussing Trump's rally at Madison Square Garden last night. Joining us for more now on Bloomberg TV and Radio is Chapin Fay. He's founder of Lighthouse Public Affairs and Republican strategist. He was at that rally yesterday. Chapin, thank you for joining us. I think we all know how this has gone down in the aftermath, the clips that have been circulating in the court of public opinion. You were there. How did all of it land in the room?
Listen, I think, some of these rallies are, if you were there, it's a lot different than what is reported or, some of the few naysayers. I will say there was a lot of energy. It was a lot more normal and regular than anyone anticipated, right? We all waited in line. We went in one by one. There was nothing going on in the crowd. There weren't even any real protesters that I saw, but he did fill Madison Square Garden completely. And there were, I don't know what the actual number was. It had dissipated by the time I had come out, but there were word that there was tens of thousands. I certainly saw thousands of people watching on the street who didn't get in. And I will say, we've read some of the coverage of some of the comments and everything, particularly by the comedian. I would note that no one refers to him as a comedian when they're talking about the things that he said. So I think it's important to be clear that he was making jokes. And I would also say that I just don't. I'm a fan of his. He has a very popular show. He was great on the Tom Brady roast. But I think the jokes that people are harping on or seizing on actually fell flat in the room, right? The Puerto Rico joke. I mean, there were barely any laughs to that one. Some of his other lines got a lot more laughs. So I'm not sure. It was also very early on, so maybe people weren't paying attention. But I'm not sure that they landed in the room. So I think the criticism of the comedian is warranted, right? If you don't like what he said, but I think some of this criticism and some of the comments about Nazi rallies. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? I mean, there have been a number of presidential candidates, both Republicans and Democrats, for decades doing rallies at Madison Square Garden, including Clinton, including Ike, LBJ, Nixon. Both Republicans and Democrats have had their conventions there. I went to one in 2004 with Governor Pataki, and I would also say. You have like Ellen Barkin wishing that Jews, calling for a Jewish man to suffer at the fate of Nazis because of what happened yesterday. I mean, this is ridiculous. The rhetoric on the left is out of control. There was a Holocaust survivor in the crowd, a Holocaust survivor who has asked for an apology from Kamala Harris. He was in the crowd, and I think we should probably follow his lead about whether this was a Nazi rally or not. And I think people need to bring the rhetoric down a little bit. I think this is the end of a campaign, and you're seeing perhaps both sides, but certainly on Kamala's side, all throw in the kitchen sink, right? I mean, if you can't fight someone on policy, let's just call him a Nazi. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Well, all right, fair enough. Or you can call him, in the case of Sid Rosenberg, who was on alongside the comedian, he called Doug Emhoff a crappy Jew. He called Democrats a bunch of degenerates, lowlifes, and Jew haters. Donald Trump's friend David Rem referred to Harris as the Antichrist last night, Chapin. We heard about from Grant Cardone, Kamala Harris's pimp handlers. Pretty tough stuff. I mean, you couldn't tell half of these jokes or read half of these lines at the Thanksgiving table this week. So, yes, it's getting hot, aside from the comedian. So I guess the question is this effective in the 11th hour for Donald Trump?
I think the rally is effective. I think the Democrats are taking the bait.
The rhetoric.
I mean, the more you call the rhetoric. Sorry, the rhetoric has been this way for a while. And I would also point out that there is a long, distinguished tradition of the left calling Republican candidates racist and Nazis. Al Gore accused George W. Bush of sending brown shirts after him. Mitt Romney was called misogynist because of binders of women. Mitt Romney, the left and the Democrats' favorite never-Trumper today, was called a misogynist because of that comment. John McCain was called a racist, even though he has non-white children. So the fact that they're calling Donald Trump at the 25th hour here a Nazi over and over again is not surprising, and it's a little disappointing. And sure, were some things said at this rally that maybe were difficult or not the best things to say? Sure, but this is in the context of a man who has been shot at and has been called a Nazi since the day he announced. So I don't really know what to tell you about the rhetoric. I mean, when someone is called a Nazi on the front page of newspapers, I mean, how do you expect people to respond? How do you expect a Jewish radio host to respond to that? Exactly how he did.
Okay, so Chapin, let's put the name calling on all sides of this aside and actually talk about the policy that is being discussed. There was some of it on that stage last night. There's still 8 days for both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris to make their closing arguments here. To get back to Joe's question, was the policy that was discussed that was maybe drowned out by a lot of this other noise enough to seal the deal for Donald Trump, or should he be trying to speak differently about the issues in these final days?
Well, I think a lot of this is baked in, particularly in the center of Manhattan, right? The people who traveled to see him and were standing outside, like I said, are all voting for him. It's already baked in. And I'm sure I've said things like this, and I'm sure other guests have said this. It almost doesn't matter what Donald Trump says to his base, right? That's baked in. Same thing for Kamala Harris voters, right? New York City Democrats are not going to watch this rally no matter what is said, no matter how moderate or nice a person Donald Trump can be. They're just not going to entertain anything that came out of it, right? So I do think the policies did get drowned out by a lot of what was said, which is unfortunate, right? We're talking about a comedian rather than the policy. Well, you're trying to, but we spent all day talking about a comedian instead of the policy. So I do think that was problematic, right, for the event. However, I do think it shows a lot of energy, and I do think while Donald Trump is not going to win New York, I do think he's going to overperform in a lot of areas, and people are going to be surprised. I think he's going to have coattails, particularly on Long Island. He may have coattails, in the Lawler district upstate, of Molinaro and Alison Esposito. And I think, you're seeing that. A lot of those folks were there or supportive of it. You saw Mike Lawler put out a statement about the remarks today, distancing himself. But I do think that, and a lot of Republicans have done that, certainly in Florida too. Again, I thought the joke fell flat.
I wanted to ask you about that part of it, Chapin. You're right. Rick Scott, we heard from Maria Elvira Salazar. We also heard from Anthony D'Esposito, of course, New York congressman. And that's the question that I have for you. The potential corrosive effect that some of the language last night might have on members of the House from New York. D'Esposito put out a statement begging Trump world to, quote, stay on message. What does it mean for him?
Well, I think it's not great, right? I do think, and it's a shame. It was not a shame, but it's ironic. It was not a comment from Donald Trump, right, that is causing this consternation. Yes. But I do think, and again, I understand he's a comedian, right? And his defenses, he was making fun of a lot of different people and categories of people. But you have to be funny, right? I will tell you, it just did not land. I turned to the people I was with and sort of shrugged my shoulders, like, what was that? And I do think, but it is going to have an effect, right? That's what the media is talking about. That's what we're talking about. And in marginal races, right, very contested races, Congressman D'Esposito is in the fight of his life. So we can't make any unforced errors, is how we talk about it in campaign business, right? And this is an unforced error out of the Trump camp, right, from the garden. Congressman Lawler too, right? One of the top targeted campaigns in the country, millions of dollars being spent. He is also in the fight of his life. While I do think he's going to pull it off, it's certainly going to be close, and things like this certainly don't help. I would say though, realpolitik crass tactics, his ability to distance himself from Trump in this manner may work, right, for him. He has been doing that, picking his battles. He's a moderate, and he's in a swing district, for lack of a better term. So I do think distancing himself from Trump and that event will have a good effect for him. Same thing with D'Esposito, who was also in a similar fight on Long Island. So I think they're trying to thread a needle where they distance themselves from the president when it will help them, and still be a supporter of his when that will help him. We'll see if it works, right? Both of these districts, particularly, I grew up in D'Esposito's district, very purple district. Even blue these days. That's right.
Siena today. Siena College has him down 12 percentage points in that race, which is one that we'll be watching closely on election night next week. Chapin, thank you for joining us and sharing your experience with us. Chapin Fay, founder of Lighthouse Public Affairs, Republican strategist here on Bloomberg. Coming up, the U.S. Army works with tech companies to speed weapons development.
What we've learned is we have to change how we buy things, and especially in the rapid, the areas where technology is moving very rapidly.
We'll have that story next from the Pentagon here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.